Some folks say home is where you hang your hat, but I reckon home is where someone waits for you to come back. Lily Montgomery had nothing when she arrived in Copper Creek, but what she didn't know was that she was about to change everything. The dusty, sun-baked town was like any other in the West, filled with hard-working folks, all struggling to make a living, to stay above the dust and heat. And there he was, Jack Donovan, a man hardened by the land, by loss, by life itself. No one had ever seen him crack, not even a smile. He was a man who had built walls so high, no one dared climb over them. But when Lily walked into his life, everything would change. She didn't come with riches, or even the promise of a perfect future. She came with nothing but a letter in her hand and hope in her heart, a heart that refused to give up even when the world had turned its back. She stood at the train station, her old suitcase clutched tightly in her hands, her shoes worn from the long journey. Copper Creek was as far from her home in Nebraska as the moon, and yet, she had no choice but to face the unknown. The people here didn't care about her, didn't even notice her. She was just another woman who had been left with nothing. But there was something about Lily that no one could ignore, not even Jack Donovan. He had heard about the woman who was coming to Copper Creek, the one who had nothing but her wits and a bit of luck. And when he saw her, standing there at the edge of the platform, he knew his life was about to change. Jack wasn't a man who believed in fate or destiny, but when his eyes locked with Lily's, something shifted deep inside him. She didn't ask for his help, didn't beg for his attention. But when she spoke, her words hit him like a shot of whiskey, clear, steady, and full of promise. She wasn't asking for charity. She wasn't asking for anything at all. She was offering a deal. I can cook. I can clean. I can work as hard as any man in this town. All I need is a place to stay. Her voice was steady, unwavering, even as the townspeople stared and whispered behind her back. Jack didn't respond at first. He just studied her, the determination in her eyes, the way she stood tall despite the world trying to push her down. He had always been a man of few words, but something about her made him want to listen, to understand. And so, he did what no one else in Copper Creek had done. He took a chance. "Follow me," he said. No promises, no grand gestures, just an invitation to a future neither of them could have predicted. They walked together, away from the noise of the station, toward the life that awaited them on the edge of town. Lily had no idea what would come next, but she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let life pass her by. She had come with nothing, but she was about to take control of everything he had. The sun had already begun its slow descent when Lily stepped into the small cabin, the smell of fresh pine wood and the earthy scent of the open prairie welcoming her inside. Jack closed the door behind them with a soft thud, and for a moment, the silence between them was thick, the kind of silence that spoke louder than words ever could. He stood just a few feet away, his broad shoulders tense as he took in the sight of her. Lily wasn't sure what she expected, but it wasn't this. The cabin was modest, one room with a small stove, a simple table, and a single bed tucked away in the corner. Yet, there was something about it that felt like home, the kind of home she had always dreamed of but never thought she'd find. She set her worn suitcase down by the door, her fingers brushing over the edges of the rough wood as she glanced around. Jack had already moved to the stove, his hands deftly starting a fire. He didn't look at her, not yet, but she could feel the weight of his gaze, even when it wasn't there. "This is it," he said quietly, his voice low and rough, as if he hadn't used it much in the past few years. "You'll have your own corner." Lily nodded, her mind racing. She wasn't sure what she had expected when she left Nebraska, but it certainly wasn't. This man, this stoic, silent cowboy who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. Still, she had no choice but to make it work. She had to prove she could do it, prove that she could live up to the expectations, even when the odds were stacked against her. "I'm not much of a cook," Jack added after a long pause, turning to face her for the first time. His eyes, cold and distant, softened just slightly as he met her gaze. "But I can keep the fire going. You'll need it." Lily smiled, a small, hesitant smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She wasn't sure how to respond. She didn't want to be a burden. She didn't want him to see her as weak, but the truth was, she was scared. Scared of the unknown. Scared of being alone. "I'll make do," she said, her voice steady, though the tremble in her hands betrayed her. "I'm used to working hard." Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he took a step toward her, his movements slow, deliberate. He looked down at her hands, calloused from years of hard labor, rough from the life she had lived. For a moment, his gaze lingered there, and Lily felt a strange pull, something she couldn't quite name. "You're not what I expected," he said, his words low and measured, as though he was still trying to figure her out. Lily met his gaze, feeling a flicker of something deep inside her chest. "I'm not what I expected either," she whispered, almost to herself. Jack gave her a long, considering look, then turned back to the stove, his broad back blocking her view of the small fire he was building. Lily stood in the center of the room, unsure of what to do next. She had come here for a fresh start, but it felt like she had stepped into a world that was much larger and more daunting than anything she had imagined. She wasn't sure if she was ready for it, but she had no choice. She had to try. The night stretched on in quiet, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the soft rustle of the wind outside. Neither of them spoke much, but it was clear that the silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was simply the beginning of something new, something neither of them could yet fully understand. When Jack finally spoke, his voice was softer, the roughness of it replaced with a gentler tone. "We'll get through this," he said, as though speaking to both of them, to the past they had both left behind. "One day at a time." Lily nodded, a weight lifting from her shoulders at the simplicity of his words. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew that with each passing day, she would find her place here, alongside this man who had been just as lost as she had been. Together, they would carve out a life from the land, and maybe, just maybe, they would find a way to heal the wounds that had kept them both in the dark for so long. The days passed slowly, the warmth of the fire becoming a constant companion in the small cabin. Lily's hands grew familiar with the rhythm of the chores, stoking the fire, gathering water from the well, cooking the simple meals Jack had come to expect. Despite the quiet, the loneliness that had once consumed her began to fade. She found herself adjusting to the rhythm of the land, the harsh yet peaceful life of the West. Jack, too, had settled into this new routine, though his presence remained distant, as though the scars of his past were still wrapped around him like the cold wind that swept across the plains. He didn't speak much, but Lily noticed the small things, the way he would always make sure the fire was stoked before going to bed, the way he checked the lock on the cabin door twice before he would finally let sleep take him. It was these quiet gestures that made her feel that perhaps, just perhaps, she was starting to belong. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jack finally broke the silence. They had just finished supper, and Lily was cleaning the dishes when he spoke, his voice low and steady. "You're different," he said, his back to her as he stood by the window, looking out over the land. Lily paused for a moment, unsure of what to say. "Different how?" she asked softly, her voice almost lost in the quiet of the room. Jack turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "You don't shy away. Most people, they'd turn and run. But you just keep going." His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Lily felt her heart skip a beat. Was he talking about her persistence? Or was he speaking about the way she had quietly begun to settle into his world? "I've had no choice but to keep going," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm not running anywhere." Jack nodded, the corner of his mouth twitching as if he was trying to suppress a smile. It wasn't much, but it was the first sign of something softening inside him. He had been so closed off when they first met, but now, after weeks of shared silence and unspoken understanding, she could see that he was beginning to thaw, just a little. The next few days brought a change. Jack began to speak more, not much, but enough to make her feel less like an outsider. He would ask her opinions on things, on how to fix the fence or where to plant the new crop. It wasn't much, but to Lily, it meant more than he could know. Slowly, she started to understand the man behind the silence, the cowboy who had buried his emotions so deeply. He was a man who had lost much, who had given up on the world but had somehow found a reason to stay. And in a way, Lily was starting to feel like she was the reason he stayed, even if neither of them would say it out loud just yet. One morning, as the first rays of dawn filtered through the cabin's small window, Jack stood up earlier than usual, his boots echoing in the quiet of the room. Lily, who had already been awake, preparing the fire for the day, watched him quietly. He grabbed his hat and looked over at her, meeting her eyes for the first time in what felt like forever. I'll be back by noon, he said, his voice steady but with a hint of something else. Need to check on the herd. Lily nodded, not trusting herself to speak. There was a part of her that had grown to rely on his presence, but she knew he was his own man, someone who needed his space just as much as she did. As he walked out of the door, she felt a strange mixture of loneliness and hope. Hope that, maybe, this was the beginning of something more than just survival, something she had long ago given up on. But in this quiet cabin, surrounded by the wilds of the West, she was starting to feel something she hadn't in a long time, something that felt like home. The days grew warmer, and with each passing week, Lily found herself becoming more accustomed to the rhythms of life on the ranch. She had learned to harness the strength of the land, to work with the wind and the soil in ways she had never imagined back in Nebraska. The simplicity of it all, the physical labor, the connection with nature, gave her a sense of purpose she had longed for. Jack, though still a man of few words, seemed to be adjusting too. They had settled into an unspoken routine, one where their actions spoke louder than any words could. He would leave early in the morning to check on the herd or work on the fences, and Lily would tend to the house, keeping the fire going, preparing meals, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. There was a strange comfort in the silence between them, a quiet understanding that neither of them had ever experienced before. But as much as she had come to appreciate the steady pace of life, there was a part of her that still felt like an outsider. Jack hadn't let her in completely, not in the way she had hoped. He still held something back, something buried deep within him that he wasn't ready to share. It was a shadow that lingered, even on the brightest of days. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the land, Jack returned from the fields earlier than usual. He didn't say anything as he entered the cabin, his boots clicking softly on the wooden floor. Lily was sitting by the fire, her hands resting in her lap as she looked up at him. "You're home early," she said, her voice soft, a touch of curiosity in it. Jack didn't answer right away. Instead, he moved to the stove, where he poured himself a cup of coffee. The silence stretched between them, comfortable yet thick with something unspoken. Lily watched him, her mind racing with thoughts she hadn't allowed herself to voice. She had spent so much time trying to understand him, trying to find a way into his world, but every time she thought she was getting closer, he would pull away again. "I've been thinking," Jack said suddenly, his voice low, breaking the silence. Lily turned to face him, her heart skipping a beat. "About what?" she asked, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her chest. Jack set the coffee mug down on the counter, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in a long while. "About what we're doing here," he said quietly. "About this life we've built." Lily felt a small pang in her chest, but she didn't look away. She had wanted to know what he was thinking, what he was feeling, but she hadn't expected him to voice it so plainly. "What about it?" she asked, keeping her tone neutral, trying not to show how much his words affected her. Jack hesitated, as if weighing his words carefully. "I never thought I'd find myself here, doing this," he admitted, his voice soft, almost hesitant. "I came to this land with nothing but a broken heart and a desire to forget. But with you here, things are changing. I'm changing." Lily's breath caught in her throat, her heart thudding in her chest. She had been waiting for this moment, waiting for him to open up, to let her in. But she hadn't expected it to feel so raw, so real. She didn't know what to say, so she said nothing, just let the silence stretch between them, thick and heavy. Finally, Jack moved closer, his footsteps slow and deliberate. He stopped in front of her, his gaze steady. "I don't know what comes next," he said, his voice rough, "but I think I'm ready to find out. With you." Lily's heart swelled in her chest as she looked up at him, her eyes meeting his. There was a vulnerability in his gaze that made her want to reach out, to pull him closer. But instead, she simply nodded, the words she had been holding back for so long finally breaking free. "I'm ready too," she whispered. Jack's lips curled into the smallest of smiles, and for the first time since she had arrived, Lily felt like they were standing on the same ground, both uncertain but willing to take the next step together. The sun had barely risen over the horizon when Lily woke to the sound of Jack's boots on the porch. It was early, the sky still dark with the faintest glow creeping over the hills, and she had been awake for a while, her mind restless with the thoughts that had been swirling around her for days. She had known things were changing between them, But this morning, something felt different. She rose from her small bed, the worn sheets slipping off her body as she stood, stretching her arms toward the ceiling. The cabin was quiet, the only sound the crackling of the fire she had built earlier. It was a simple life, but it was hers now. She had found her place, or at least, she thought she had. Jack had been quieter than usual the past few days, retreating into himself again after their conversation by the stove. His distance was familiar, like the way the cold settled in at night, but it didn't feel the same this time. She had expected things to take time, to adjust, but she hadn't expected to feel this uncertainty again. She pushed open the cabin door, the cool morning air greeting her as she stepped outside. Jack was already tending to the horses, his movements purposeful but slow, as if lost in thought. He didn't notice her at first, but when he did, he gave her a quick glance, his eyes soft but guarded. "Morning," he said, his voice rough from the early hour. "Morning," she replied, walking over to where he stood. The silence between them stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that had become a part of their lives, the kind that said everything without needing words. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he was avoiding her gaze. It was the same way he'd been since the day they had admitted, in their own quiet way, that things were changing. But this time, it felt different, like the weight of the unspoken was heavier than ever. "You're up early," she said, trying to break the silence, to make him look at her. "Yeah," Jack replied, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. "Got a lot to do today. Check the fences, clear some brush. You know how it is." Lily nodded, but there was a small knot in her stomach. She wanted to ask him what was going on, what was bothering him, but she didn't. Instead, she moved closer, picking up the small brush and helping him with the horses. She knew better than to push him, but the silence was becoming unbearable. They worked side by side in the stillness, the only sounds their movements and the soft neighing of the horses. It wasn't much, but it was enough. After a while, Jack spoke again, his voice quieter this time. "I've been thinking," he said, his gaze still on the horse he was brushing. "About us. About everything." Lily's heart skipped a beat. She had been waiting for this, for him to say something, to acknowledge the shift that had happened between them. She didn't say anything, just waited, her hands still moving on the brush. "I don't know what this is, Lily," he continued, his voice almost a whisper. "I don't know if I'm ready for it. For you." Her breath caught in her throat. She had hoped for something more, but hearing his uncertainty felt like a weight lifting from her chest. He was being honest, and for the first time in a long while, she felt the honesty between them. "I'm not asking for anything, Jack," she said softly, her voice steady. "I'm just here, and I'm not going anywhere." Jack turned to face her then, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in days. There was a vulnerability in his gaze, something raw and real. "I don't know what I'm doing, but I know I don't want to lose this." "Not again," he said, his words filled with something Lily couldn't quite name. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was filled with possibility, with something they hadn't allowed themselves to see before. And in that moment, standing there in the quiet of the morning, Lily realized that maybe, just maybe, they were both ready to face whatever came next, together. The days had begun to stretch into weeks, and as summer settled over the land, the heat became a constant companion. Lily had grown used to the rhythm of the work, to the quiet mornings and long afternoons that filled her days. Jack, too, had found a rhythm, though there was something still distant about him, something buried beneath the surface that Lily couldn't quite reach. They had built a life together in the small cabin, but it wasn't until one evening, after the sun had dipped below the horizon and the air had cooled, that Jack spoke again, his words breaking through the silence that had settled between them. It had been a long day of work. Jack had spent the afternoon repairing the fence, while Lily had worked on the garden, pulling weeds and tending to the plants that had begun to take root in the rich soil. They had shared a simple meal, beans and cornbread, and now, as the fire crackled in the hearth, they sat together, each lost in their own thoughts. Jack leaned back against the wall, his arms crossed over his chest, his gaze fixed on the flames. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the only sound the gentle crackling of the fire. Then Jack broke the silence, his voice quiet but steady. "I don't know how to do this, Lily," he said, his eyes never leaving the fire. "I don't know how to let someone in again." Lily looked at him, her heart tightening in her chest. She had known that there was something he was holding back, something he had yet to share, but hearing him say it out loud made it all the more real. "You don't have to have all the answers right now," she replied softly, her voice steady. "We don't need to rush this. We just need to take it one day at a time." Jack finally looked at her, his gaze soft but guarded. "It's not just about taking it slow," he said, his voice low. "It's about not being able to open up, not being able to trust, not being able to." He trailed off, his words hanging in the air between them. Lily's heart ached for him. She could see the weight of his past, the pain that he carried with him every day. But she also saw the man who had been so kind to her, so steady and strong, even in his silence. "I'm not asking for all of you, Jack," she said gently. "I'm asking for what you're ready to give. And if that's just a little bit at a time, then that's okay. I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Jack stared at her for a long moment, as though trying to read her, to figure out if she was telling the truth. Finally, he sighed, a deep, long breath that seemed to release some of the tension that had been coiled tight inside him. "I don't deserve you," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Lily shook her head, her eyes soft. "You don't have to deserve me, Jack. You just have to be here. And I'll be here too." The room fell silent once more, but this time, the silence didn't feel heavy. It felt like a promise, an unspoken understanding between them. The night stretched on, and as the fire burned low, Jack reached over and took her hand in his. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was everything she had hoped for. It was enough. And in that small moment, as the warmth of his hand settled in hers, Lily knew that this was the beginning of something more, something real. Together, they would face whatever came next, one day at a time. As the days grew longer and the heat of summer settled deeper over the land, Lily and Jack continued their quiet routine, a life that, despite its simplicity, felt more like home with each passing day. They had found their rhythm, the unspoken bond between them growing stronger, woven together by the steady tasks they shared and the unspoken understanding that seemed to settle into every room of the small cabin. Still, the weight of Jack's past lingered, a shadow in the corners of their otherwise peaceful existence. Lily could feel it, the way he would sometimes retreat into himself, pulling away even when she thought they were beginning to close the gap. She didn't push him, though. She had learned to be patient, to let him come to her in his own time. And when he did, she was always there, her heart open and steady. One afternoon, as the sun blazed high in the sky, Jack returned from the fields earlier than usual. He seemed worn, more tired than she had seen him in weeks, his face drawn and weary. Lily was by the stove, preparing dinner, when he stepped inside, his boots kicking up dust as he crossed the threshold. She glanced up at him, her expression softening at the sight of him. "You're home early," she said, her voice gentle, as she wiped her hands on the apron she wore. Jack didn't answer immediately. He stood by the door for a moment, taking in the quiet of the room before his eyes met hers. There was something in his gaze, a storm brewing beneath the calm exterior. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low, almost reluctant. "About what?" Lily asked, her heart tightening in her chest, sensing that this wasn't just another conversation about the work that needed to be done. Jack hesitated, his eyes flickering to the fire before returning to her. "About us," he said, the words simple but heavy. "About how I don't know if I'm ready to let go of all the things I've been holding on to." Lily's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't speak. She just watched him, waiting for him to say more. Jack ran a hand through his hair, a weary gesture that spoke of the burden he carried. "I've been alone for so long, Lily," he said, his voice rough, his eyes dark with the weight of his past. "It's easier that way. Easier to keep people at a distance. Easier to push everything down and just keep going." He looked at her then, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time in a way that was deeper than just the surface. "But you've been here, with me, and I don't know how to deal with that. I don't know how to let someone in." Lily's heart ached at his words, but she didn't move. She didn't reach out. She just let him speak, let him unravel the layers he had kept so tightly wound around himself for so long. "I don't expect you to have all the answers, Jack," she said softly, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "But I'm not going anywhere. I'm here, and I'm not leaving." Jack's eyes softened, just slightly, as he took a step toward her. The distance between them, once so vast, seemed to close with that single step. He reached for her, his hand brushing against hers, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the weight that had held him down seemed to lift, if only for a moment. "I don't know how to do this," Jack murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I'm willing to try. With you." Lily's heart swelled in her chest, the raw honesty of his words settling deep within her. She took his hand, her fingers curling around his, and without saying another word, she knew they were both ready, in their own way, to face whatever came next. Together, the night stretched on, quiet and still, but in that silence, they both knew that something had shifted, something deep and real. And in that moment, under the soft glow of the firelight, Lily felt like she was exactly where she was meant to be. The weeks slipped by, each one blending into the next, until the harsh heat of summer began to wane. The mornings grew cooler, and the land around the cabin seemed to breathe a sigh of relief as the long days of relentless sun softened into a more bearable warmth. Life had settled into a steady rhythm, one that was built on the simplicity of shared work and quiet moments. Lily had become more attuned to the land, to the small changes in the seasons, and to the subtle shifts in Jack's moods. She noticed the way he seemed to linger a little longer when he returned from his chores, or the way he would look at her, his eyes soft and filled with unspoken words. But despite the small steps forward, there was still a wall between them. Jack had started to open up, to share bits and pieces of his past with her, but there was always something he kept hidden. She had long since learned not to push him, not to demand answers he wasn't ready to give. Instead, she focused on the life they were building together, the small moments that spoke louder than any words ever could. One morning, after a long night of rain, the air was fresh and crisp, and the scent of earth and wet grass hung in the air. Lily was sitting on the porch, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders as she watched the mist rise off the land. She had become accustomed to these quiet mornings, when the world seemed to pause for just a moment, allowing her to breathe and take in the peace that had become a part of her life. Jack came out onto the porch, his boots heavy against the wood as he approached her. His hair was damp from the morning rain, and his face was softer than usual, the lines of weariness fading just a little. He stood beside her for a moment, his eyes following her gaze across the land. "It's beautiful," Lily said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jack didn't answer right away. He simply stood there, his presence solid and comforting beside her. There was a stillness between them, one that wasn't uncomfortable but full of the weight of everything they hadn't yet said. Finally, Jack spoke, his voice rough but steady. "I never thought I'd be here," he said, his eyes meeting hers. "I thought I'd always be alone, always stuck in the past. But you've made me see things differently. Made me see that maybe I don't have to carry all of it." Lily felt a tightness in her chest, a mixture of relief and something else she couldn't name. She didn't know how to respond, didn't have the words to tell him how much those words meant to her. Instead, she reached out, placing her hand over his. Jack's fingers curled around hers, and for the first time, she felt him fully present, not just physically but emotionally as well. They stood in silence, the cool morning air swirling around them, as the world around them seemed to hold its breath. In that moment, Lily knew that no matter what came next, they would face it together. They had come this far, and they had proven to each other that even the deepest wounds could begin to heal when given time, trust, and the simple act of being there for one another. Jack turned to face her then, his gaze steady. "I'm not perfect, Lily," he said, his voice low but full of sincerity. "But I'm here, and I'm not going anywhere." Lily smiled, her heart swelling in her chest. "Neither am I," she replied, her voice steady and full of certainty. The rain had stopped, and the first rays of sunlight pierced through the clouds, casting a golden glow over the land. It was a new day, a new beginning, and Lily felt something shift inside her, something that told her this was just the start of the journey they would take together. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. Together, they could face whatever came next, one step at a time. The seasons continued their slow, inevitable turn, and with it, Jack and Lily's life together grew deeper, rooted in the land they worked and the quiet moments they shared. It had been months since that first night when they'd begun to open up to each other, when Jack had finally let down the walls he had spent so many years building around his heart. The mornings were still crisp, and the air held a freshness that reminded Lily of the first time she had arrived in Copper Creek. The landscape was changing too, the wildflowers now giving way to the golden hues of late summer, and the land itself seemed to pulse with life. Jack had become more present, his movements around the cabin more at ease, his voice less guarded. There were still moments when his past seemed to rear its head, but those moments were fewer now. The silence between them was no longer heavy. It was comfortable, filled with the sounds of their shared life. One morning, Lily woke earlier than usual, the pale light of dawn creeping through the cracks in the window. She had learned to wake with the sun, the quiet of the early hours a time for herself before the day's work began. She sat by the window, watching the first lights stretch over the land, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and purple. As she sat there, a familiar sense of peace settled over her, one she had never known before. The sound of boots on the porch broke her reverie, and she turned to see Jack standing in the doorway, his silhouette framed by the light. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in the way he looked at her, something different than before. "Morning," she said, her voice gentle, a smile tugging at her lips. Jack stepped into the room, his eyes meeting hers. "Morning," he replied, his voice steady but warm. There was a quiet moment between them, one of those moments where words didn't feel necessary. Jack walked over to her, his steps slow but deliberate, and he stood next to her by the window. They both looked out at the land, the rolling hills stretching out before them. "It's beautiful out here," Lily said, her voice soft, almost reverent. "Yeah," Jack replied, his tone quieter than usual. "It's home." The words were simple, but they carried a weight. For so long, Jack had never considered this place home, always seeing it as just another stop, another place to bury his past. But now it was clear, this was where he had built something real, something lasting. It was where he had found her, where they had built their life together. Jack turned to her then, his expression softening. "I never thought I could find peace again," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But with you, it feels like I finally can." Lily's heart swelled at his words, and she turned to face him fully. There was a tenderness in his eyes, one that had taken time to unfold, but it was there, steady and true. She reached for his hand, her fingers brushing his, and in that small gesture, she felt the connection between them solidify, stronger than before. "You're not alone anymore," she said softly. Jack's gaze lingered on her, his lips curving into the faintest smile. "No," he said quietly. "I'm not." They stood there for a while, in the quiet of the morning, the weight of their unspoken promises hanging in the air between them. It wasn't much, just the two of them, in a cabin on the edge of the land they had come to call home. But in that moment, it felt like everything. As the sun rose higher, casting its golden light over the landscape, Lily felt a sense of belonging, one that had been missing for so long. She wasn't just a woman passing through anymore. She was a part of this place, a part of Jack's life, and in return, he was becoming a part of hers. Together, they had built something solid, something real, and whatever the future held, they would face it as one. The months continued to roll by, each one bringing a new layer to their life together. The fall colors had begun to paint the land in shades of orange and red, the air crisp and full of change. Lily had grown accustomed to the steady rhythm of their days, her hands working the earth, Jack tending to the animals, and in the evenings, they would sit together, sharing a quiet meal and the unspoken comfort of each other's company. It was a simple life, but it was theirs. One afternoon, as the sun began to dip behind the hills, Jack came inside, his face flushed from the cool breeze that had picked up during the day. Lily was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when he stepped into the room, his boots clicking softly on the wooden floor. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, and she could sense the weight of something unspoken in the air between them. "Everything all right?" she asked, turning toward him as she stirred the pot on the stove. Jack nodded, but there was something in his eyes, something that told her he was far from all right. "Just thinking," he said quietly, his voice low and steady. Lily wiped her hands on her apron and walked over to where he stood. She reached out, touching his arm gently. "About what?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. Jack hesitated, his gaze drifting to the fire in the hearth. "About how much has changed," he said slowly. "How much I've changed." Lily's heart tightened at the sound of his voice, the raw honesty in his words. She had known that the past was never truly gone for Jack, that the scars from it ran deep, but she hadn't expected him to voice it so plainly. "You've come a long way, Jack," she said gently. "We both have." He turned to face her then, his eyes meeting hers with a vulnerability she hadn't seen in a long time. "I don't know how to thank you for that," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "For sticking around when I wasn't sure I deserved it." Lily smiled softly, her heart swelling with a tenderness she couldn't put into words. "You don't have to thank me," she said. "You just have to keep being you." Jack's gaze softened, and for a moment, the weight of his past seemed to lift from his shoulders. He reached out and pulled her close, wrapping his arms around her in a simple but meaningful embrace. "I never thought I'd find someone like you," he murmured, his voice muffled against her hair. "But I'm glad I did." Lily closed her eyes, her fingers tracing the back of his shirt as she leaned into his embrace. "Me too," she whispered. The moment stretched between them, quiet and still, but in the peacefulness of it, they both knew that they had found something rare and real. It wasn't perfect, but it was theirs. As the fire crackled in the hearth and the night fell around them, they stood together in the warmth of their home, the weight of their shared life making them feel more connected than ever before. No longer burdened by the past, no longer afraid of the future, they were finally standing side by side, ready to face whatever came next, together. The cold of winter had begun to settle over Copper Creek, the once golden fields now hidden under a blanket of snow. The air was sharp with frost, and the trees stood bare against the pale sky. Lily had always found something peaceful in the quiet of winter, the way the world seemed to slow down, allowing for moments of reflection. It was a time for rest, a time for the land to breathe before the cycle began again in spring. Inside their small cabin, the fire crackled merrily in the hearth, its warmth filling the room as Lily and Jack sat by the fire, side by side. Jack had become more relaxed over the past few months, his posture less tense, his eyes softer when he looked at her. It wasn't that he was entirely free of his past, but Lily could see the change in him, the way he had started to embrace the life they were building, instead of running from it. "It's quiet out there," Lily said, her voice gentle as she glanced out the window at the snow falling softly outside. "Yeah," Jack replied, his voice low, his gaze following hers to the winter landscape. "It's the kind of quiet that makes you think." Lily turned to him then, her eyes meeting his. "What do you think about when it gets quiet like this?" Jack's gaze seemed to soften as he turned to face her fully, the firelight dancing across his features. "I think about how much has changed," he said slowly, his voice steady. "I think about how, for the first time in a long while, I'm not afraid of what comes next. I'm not worried about losing everything." Lily's heart swelled at his words, the honesty in them settling deep inside her. She had always known that Jack's fears ran deep, that his past had left scars that would take time to heal. But hearing him say that he was no longer afraid, it meant more than she could express. "You don't have to worry anymore, Jack," she said softly, her voice full of tenderness. "We have each other, and that's enough." Jack didn't speak right away, but his gaze held hers with a kind of intensity that made her heart race. Finally, he reached out, taking her hand in his fingers warm against her skin. "I never thought I'd get here," he said quietly, his thumb gently brushing over her hand. "But I'm glad I did." Lily smiled softly, her heart full of quiet joy. "Me too," she whispered. They sat in silence for a moment, the kind of silence that spoke volumes without needing any words. The fire flickered in the hearth, casting shadows on the walls, and outside, the world continued to sleep beneath its blanket of snow. In that moment, Lily felt a deep sense of peace, a certainty that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. Their journey was far from over, but for the first time, Lily felt like they were both ready for whatever came next. The quiet of winter, the stillness of the world around them, felt like the perfect backdrop for the new chapter they were about to begin. Together, they would face whatever challenges came their way, one day at a time, knowing that with each other, they were stronger than anything life could throw at them. The first snow of winter had begun to melt, and with it, the earth beneath Copper Creek softened, readying itself for the new season that would eventually come. The days were still cool, but the harsh chill of winter was beginning to lose its grip. Inside the cabin, the warmth from the fire felt like a blanket, wrapping them in a sense of peace and comfort that neither Jack nor Lily had known before. Their mornings began early, the first light of day creeping through the window as they prepared for the work ahead. Jack had grown more comfortable in the silence between them, the weight of his past no longer weighing as heavily on his shoulders. The quiet had become a space where they both found comfort, where words were often unnecessary. On a morning like this, when the sun was barely rising and the air was still cool with the remnants of the night, Lily found herself lost in thought as she stood at the window, watching the world slowly come to life. Jack had already gone outside to check on the horses, his movements purposeful as he moved across the land that had become so familiar to both of them. She knew the routine now, the way he always checked the fences, the way he would pause to look out over the land, as though reflecting on something deeper. It was in those quiet moments that Lily realized how much he had changed. He was still the same man, the one who had come to Copper Creek with a past that had broken him, but now there was a quiet strength in him, a calmness that wasn't there before. She couldn't help but wonder if it was because of her, or if it was just the life they had built together, but she didn't ask. She didn't need to. The fact that he was here, that they were together, was enough. When Jack returned inside, his jacket dusted with snow from his morning rounds, Lily was still by the window. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, watching her as she gazed out at the land. "It's going to be a good year," Jack said quietly, his voice steady but filled with something deeper, something hopeful. Lily turned to face him, her heart lifting at the sound of his words. "I think so too," she replied, her voice soft. Jack stepped closer, the warmth from the fire illuminating his features as he looked at her with a steady gaze. "We've come a long way, haven't we?" he said, his voice low, almost as if he were speaking to himself. "Yes," Lily said, walking over to him, her heart swelling with the truth of it. "We have." Jack reached for her hand then, his fingers warm against hers, and for a moment, they stood there in the quiet of the room, their hands intertwined, knowing that this was their life now. This simple, quiet life they had built together. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And for the first time in a long while, Lily felt certain of one thing. They had finally found peace, not just in the land, but in each other. As the days turned to weeks, the land around them began to show the first signs of spring. The ground, still soft from the winter thaw, was ready to be worked again, and they began the task of planting new crops, tending to the land that had already begun to give them so much. Jack and Lily worked side by side, the silence between them no longer filled with uncertainty, but with a shared sense of purpose. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic declaration, but there didn't need to be. Their connection had grown stronger with each passing day, built on trust, on the quiet moments, and on the promise that no matter what came next, they would face it together. The future was still uncertain, but in that moment, with the warmth of the sun on their backs and the promise of a new season ahead, Lily knew that they were ready for whatever came next. They had each other, and that was all they needed. The warmth of spring was undeniable, and with each passing day, Copper Creek seemed to come to life. The land, once covered in snow, was now awakening with new growth. The air smelled of fresh earth and budding flowers, a sharp contrast to the bitter cold that had gripped the town just months ago. Jack and Lily worked together as they always did, side by side, preparing the soil for the crops they would plant. There was a sense of peace between them now, something that had settled deep within both of them, a comfort in the rhythm of their shared life. The long days of labor, the quiet evenings spent by the fire, and the soft moments between them had created a bond stronger than either of them could have imagined. Jack, once distant and closed off, had become someone she could rely on without question. He was still a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes. The way he would help without asking, the way he would make sure she had everything she needed, and the way he would simply be there with her when she needed him most. Lily had changed too. She had found a strength in herself she hadn't known existed. She had found a place in this land, a place with Jack, and for the first time in her life, she felt like she belonged. They weren't perfect, no one was, but together, they had created something real. It wasn't always easy, and there were still moments when the weight of their pasts threatened to pull them apart, but they had learned to navigate those moments together, to lean on each other when the world felt too heavy. One evening, as the sun began to set, casting A warm glow over the cabin. Jack and Lily stood on the porch, looking out at the land they had worked so hard to cultivate. The crops were beginning to sprout, and the air smelled of fresh earth and new beginnings. "It's beautiful," Lily said softly, her voice carrying in the evening air. Jack didn't say anything at first, just stood there beside her, his gaze fixed on the horizon. But after a moment, he spoke, his voice quiet but steady. "It is," he said, his tone filled with something deeper than just the beauty of the land. Lily turned to him then, her eyes searching his face. "You've changed," she said, her voice gentle but full of meaning. Jack looked at her, his expression softening as he met her gaze. "I know," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. "And I think I'm finally okay with that." Lily smiled then, her heart swelling with a warmth she couldn't quite describe. She reached out, placing her hand on his, her fingers curling around his gently. "I'm glad," she whispered, her voice full of tenderness. Jack turned to her then, his hand reaching up to gently tuck a strand of hair behind her ear. "I'm glad too," he said, his voice soft but full of sincerity. For a moment, they stood there in silence, the world around them fading away. There was no need for words. They had come so far together, through the quiet struggles and the small victories, and now, standing side by side, they both knew that whatever the future held, they would face it together. The road ahead was uncertain, as it always was, but they had each other, and that was enough. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in the soft glow of twilight, and for the first time in a long while, Lily felt like everything was exactly as it should be. She wasn't just a woman passing through anymore. She was a part of something, and that something was enough to carry her through whatever came next.